Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Chapter 1. The Last Straw. Nadine stood in the doorway of her bedroom watching Marcus pack his suitcase with the kind of speed that meant he'd already checked out emotionally weeks ago. The kids were downstairs. She could hear Donte trying to keep them quiet, his 12-year-old voice cracking as he told 7-year-old Amaya to stop crying. The Atlanta summer heat pressed against the windows like it was trying to get in and witness this humiliation too. Marcus didn't even look at her as he zipped the bag. His jaw set in that way that meant his mind was made up and nothing she said would matter. She'd known this was coming, but somehow the reality of it felt like being pushed off a cliff she didn't see. 43 years old, with 6 grandkids she'd been raising since her daughter Keisha died 3 years ago, and a man walking out because he said he couldn't do this no more, like she'd been doing it by herself the whole time anyway. Young grandma, they called her. Too young to have buried her only child. Too young to be raising babies again when she should have been enjoying her freedom. So that's it, Nadine heard herself say, her voice sounding smaller than she wanted it to. Marcus finally looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. Relief. He was relieved to be leaving. Not sad, not conflicted, not even angry. Just done. I can't keep pretending I'm built for this, Nadine, he said, slinging the bag over his shoulder. 6 kids that ain't even mine? We can barely keep the lights on. I'm suffocating here. She wanted to scream that she was suffocating too, that she'd been 50 when Keisha got pregnant with Donte and had spent every year since then helping raise babies while working double shifts. And now Keisha was gone, and these babies were all Nadine had left of her daughter. But Amaya's crying got louder downstairs, and she heard something crash, probably Caleb knocking over the fan again, and Marcus used that exact moment to slip past her like smoke. She followed him down the stairs where all 6 kids were now standing in the narrow hallway of their duplex, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear that made Nadine's chest hurt. Donte held baby Sienna on his hip, even though he was too small to be holding a 1-year-old for that long. Twins Ezra and Elijah stood side by side like they always did, their matching faces frozen in identical expressions of trying not to cry. Caleb clutched his stuffed dinosaur, and Amaya's tears had made tracks down her cheeks that caught the afternoon light coming through the screen door. Marcus looked at them for exactly 3 seconds before he opened that door and stepped out into the thick Georgia heat without saying goodbye. Just like that. Like they were strangers. Like he hadn't been in their lives for 2 years, pretending to be something like a grandfather figure. Like Nadine hadn't been cooking his meals and washing his clothes, while she raised 6 kids that weren't his responsibility, but had become hers when God took her baby girl too soon. Nadine stood there, feeling the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on her, waiting for her to fix this, to explain it, to make it make sense. But how do you explain to your grandbabies that another man chose nothing over them? The air in the house felt too thick to breathe, and she could hear Mrs. Chen's TV through the thin walls, playing one of those judge shows she loved. Outside, Marcus's car started up and pulled away, the sound of the engine fading like a promise nobody ever meant to keep. Donte shifted Sienna to his other hip and looked at his grandmother with eyes that had seen too much too fast. First his mother's death, now this. Is he coming back? He asked, even though something in his voice said he already knew. Nadine opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out because she didn't want to lie. But the truth felt too heavy to put into words her grandbabies could carry. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement on the porch next door. Callum, their neighbor, was standing there with a bag of groceries in his hands, clearly having witnessed the whole thing. He was a white man in his early 40s, who'd moved in 6 months ago and mostly kept to himself except for the occasional head nod or good morning when their paths crossed. But right now he was looking at her with something that wasn't pity. It was recognition, like he knew exactly what that kind of leaving felt like. Their eyes met for just a second before Amaya grabbed Nadine's leg and buried her face in her grandmother's worn jeans. And Nadine had to look away because she couldn't handle kindness from a stranger when her own man couldn't even manage cruelty with words. She had to be strong now. 6 grandbabies were counting on her, and she didn't have the luxury of falling apart. But standing there in that hallway with her daughter's children clinging to her and Marcus's absence filling the house like smoke, Nadine had never felt more alone in her entire life. Young grandma with old problems trying to raise babies when her body was already tired from raising the first one. Chapter 2, Jarnor. 6 months earlier, the duplex on Glenwood Avenue had been Nadine's safe haven for 5 years, even if the rent kept going up and the air conditioning only worked when it felt like it. She'd moved here after Keisha died, needing a fresh start where every corner didn't remind her of the daughter she'd lost to a car accident that still didn't make sense. Keisha had been 25 with 6 kids by 3 different daddies, and Nadine had been helping raise them all because that's what you did. You stepped up when that drunk driver ran the red light and took her baby girl. Nadine had gone from helping grandmother to full-time mother overnight at 43 years old. The neighborhood was mixed, black families, Latinos, a few white folks, and Mrs. Chin, who'd lived in the house behind them since 1987 and knew everybody's business. Nadine had painted the duplex front door yellow herself because Keisha had always loved yellow. Said it made her think of sunshine even on dark days. That February morning when Callum moved in next door, Nadine had been juggling Sienna on her hip while trying to get Caleb's shoes on for school. The moving truck blocked half the street, and she'd been annoyed at first because it meant she'd have to park further away when she got home from her shift at the nursing home. But then she'd seen him, tall and lean with sandy brown hair pulled back in a small bun, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans that had actual paint stains on them, not the fake kind from expensive stores. He'd been carrying a box marked kitchen when their eyes met, and he'd given her this small, tired smile that said moving was kicking his ass. She'd nodded back and minded her business because she had enough on her plate without adding neighborly small talk. Marcus had been sitting in the house on his phone, supposedly looking for work, but really just scrolling through whatever kept his attention these days. Over the next few weeks, Nadine noticed things about Callum without meaning to. He left for work early. She'd hear his truck start up around 5:30 in the morning when she was up with Sienna. He came home covered in drywall dust or paint, sometimes carrying takeout from the Mexican spot on the corner, always alone. No woman ever showed up. No friends stopped by. He lived quietly, kept his porch clean, and occasionally sat out there in the evenings with a beer and a book, which struck Nadine as the loneliest image she'd seen in a while. Once, when she was wrestling 3 bags of groceries and a screaming Amaya out of the car, he'd appeared at her elbow and just taken 2 of the bags without asking. She'd been too surprised to protest and had followed him to her door, where he'd set them down gently and said, "Have a good one," before walking back to his place like it was nothing. "Who the hell is that?" Marcus had asked from the couch where he'd been the entire time, not even getting up to help with the groceries or check on why Amaya was having a meltdown. Nadine had felt irritation flash through her sharp and hot. "The neighbor," she said flatly, moving past him to put the milk away before it spoiled. "Looks like he was being friendly with you," Marcus had said with that edge in his voice that meant he was picking a fight because he was bored. She turned on him then, Amaya still crying on her hip, exhaustion making her sharp. He helped with the groceries while you sat on your behind. That's called being a decent human being. You should try it. The fight that followed had been loud enough that she'd seen Callum's living room curtain move slightly, and she felt embarrassed that a stranger was learning their dysfunction through thin walls. At 43, raising 6 kids that should have been her daughter's responsibility, she didn't have energy for Marcus's insecure nonsense. But what stayed with Nadine after that day wasn't the fight. It was the way Callum had helped without making it a thing, without expecting gratitude or praise or anything in return. It was such a small gesture, but it had landed in her chest like a stone in water, creating ripples she didn't understand yet. That night, after she'd gotten all 6 kids to sleep in their various beds and floor mattresses, she'd stood in her bathroom looking at herself in the mirror. 43, and she looked 50. Hair pulled back in the same ponytail she'd worn for 3 days, dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, a body that had carried 1 baby and helped raise 7 more, showing every single year of that labor. Marcus hadn't touched her in months, and she told herself she didn't care, but standing there alone, she felt invisible, like she'd disappeared under the weight of grief and grandmotherhood, and nobody had noticed. From next door, she could hear the faint sound of music, something acoustic and sad that matched the ache in her chest she didn't have words for yet. Young grandma with an old soul carrying weight nobody should have to carry alone. Chapter 3, The Unraveling. By April, the cracks in Nadine's life had become canyons. Marcus lost another job, this time from a construction site where he'd shown up late 3 times in 1 week. He'd come home angry, blaming the foreman, blaming the economy, blaming everything except his own choices. The lights got cut off for 4 days until Nadine's sister sent money she couldn't afford to send, and Nadine had cried in the bathroom with the door locked so the kids wouldn't hire. Donte had started getting into trouble at school, talking back to teachers, picking fights with boys twice his size. He was angry about losing his mother, and Nadine knew it, but she didn't have the time or energy to fix it when she was barely holding herself together. The twins needed new shoes. Amaya needed medicine for her asthma. Caleb was having nightmares where he called out for his mama who wasn't coming back. Sienna was teething. And Marcus sat on that couch like a piece of furniture that stopped being useful, but nobody had thrown out yet. The morning everything shifted, Nadine had been running on 3 hours of sleep and coffee that tasted like desperation. She'd missed the bus for work and had to call her supervisor, begging for understanding she wasn't sure she'd get. Caleb had spilled juice all over himself right before school. The twins were fighting over a toy that was already broken. Marcus was still asleep at 10 in the morning, like he didn't have a care in the world. Nadine felt something inside her snap like a dried branch. She'd marched into their bedroom and yanked the covers off him with enough force that he'd sat up, startled and angry. "Get up," she said, her voice cold enough to freeze water. "Get up and help me or get out. I'm not doing this anymore. I buried my daughter and took on these babies because they're my blood and I love them. But you chose to be here. So either act like it or leave." "You tripping," Marcus had said, reaching for the covers. Nadine had thrown them on the floor. "I'm working doubles at the nursing home, wiping behinds and lifting patients twice my size, coming home to these grandbabies, cooking, clean, and doing homework, breaking up fights, and you sitting here sleeping till noon like you on vacation. What exactly do you do, Marcus? Tell me, because from where I'm standing, you just take up space and eat my food." The fight had been nuclear. He'd called her names that made her throat tight with hurt. She told him truths that had been building up for 2 years since he'd moved in, talking about helping her through her grief. The kids had heard all of it, and that made her feel like the worst grandmother in the world, but she couldn't stop, couldn't take it back, couldn't pretend anymore. When Marcus had stormed out and didn't come back for 2 days, Nadine had felt equal parts relief and terror. because what if he never came back, and what if he did? It was during one of those Marcus-less nights that Callum had knocked on her door. Nadine had been sitting on the porch steps at 10 at night because the house felt too small and too loud even in silence. She'd heard his footsteps and looked up to find him standing there with a grocery bag in his hands, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I heard you might need some things," he'd said quietly. And when she'd looked in the bag, she'd seen milk, bread, peanut butter, a box of diapers, and juice boxes. Her pride had wanted to refuse, but her empty fridge overruled it. "You don't have to," she'd started, but he'd shaken his head. "I know I don't have to, but I'm offering. No strings, no payback, just neighbor to neighbor." The kindness had broken something in her, and she'd cried right there on those steps while this white man she barely knew sat down beside her and didn't say a word, just sat there until she was done. "Why?" Nadine had asked when she could finally speak, her voice raw from crying. Callum had been quiet for a long moment, staring out at the empty street. "Because I know what it's like to feel alone in a house full of people," he'd said finally. And there was something in his voice that told her he wasn't just talking about her situation. "And because those kids deserve better than what they're getting right now. So do you. You're raising your daughter's children by yourself when you should be able to grieve her properly. That's not fair, and you shouldn't have to do it alone." They'd sat there in the sticky Georgia night with the sound of Mrs. Chen's TV drifting over the fence, and somewhere in the distance a dog barking, and Nadine had felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. Like looking in a mirror and seeing someone who understood the weight you carried. When she'd gone back inside, the grocery bag in her hands, Donte had been standing in the living room. "That was the neighbor," she'd explained, but Dante's eyes had held a question she wasn't ready to answer yet. Young grandma learning that help could come from unexpected places, even when pride said you should handle it alone. Chapter 4, Small Mercies. The summer heat arrived in May like it had a personal vendetta against Atlanta, and with it came a new rhythm in Nadine's life that she hadn't expected. Marcus came and went like weather, sometimes present for 3 days straight, sometimes gone for a week. She stopped asking where he'd been because the answers were always lies wrapped in more lies. What surprised her was how much easier things got when he wasn't there, how the house breathed better without his weight in it. The kids fought less. Dante's shoulders relaxed. Nadine found herself smiling at stupid things like Caleb's knock-knock jokes that made no sense, or the way Ezra would narrate everything he did, like he was hosting his own TV show. And somehow, without her planning it or seeing it coming, Callum became part of their landscape. It started small. He'd be outside fixing his porch railing when Nadine came home with the kids, and he'd wave. Simple as that. Then one Saturday, he'd noticed her struggling to get the lawnmower started and had come over to look at it, spending 20 minutes getting it running while the twins watched him like he was performing magic. Another time, when Sienna had been crying for an hour straight with teething pain and Nadine was about to lose her mind, he'd appeared at the door with a frozen teething ring and some gel his sister had recommended when her kids were babies. "How did you know?" Nadine had asked, exhausted and grateful. "Thin walls," he'd said with a small smile. "And Google." She'd laughed for the first time in weeks, and the sound had felt foreign in her own throat, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. A 43-year-old grandmother laughing like she was young again, even if just for a moment. Callum never crossed lines. He never asked about Marcus directly. Never asked about Keisha's death, even though Nadine knew Mrs. Chen had probably told him the whole story. Never made Nadine feel like his help came with expectations. He was just there. Steady as a metronome in a life that felt like chaos set to a drum beat, she couldn't keep up with. He worked in construction and restoration, she'd learned, fixing up old houses and bringing them back to life. He'd moved to Atlanta from somewhere in North Carolina after a divorce that he didn't talk about, except to say it had been brutal and necessary. He had a daughter he saw every other weekend, a 10-year-old named Riley, who had his same quiet intensity and love of books. The first time Nadine met Riley, the girl had been sitting on Callum's porch reading while Amaya played in the yard. And without prompting, Riley had asked Amaya if she wanted to hear a story. And Nadine had almost cried watching her granddaughter's face light up the way it used to when Keisha read to her. "You got a good kid," Nadine had told Callum later that evening when Riley's mom had picked her up and the kids were inside eating the spaghetti Nadine had stretched with extra sauce to make it feed 7. They'd been standing in that space between their porches, not quite his property, not quite hers. Neutral ground that felt safer than getting too close. "Thanks," Callum had said, his face softening the way it always did when Riley came up. "She's the best thing I ever did. Only thing I did right, actually." Nadine had understood that sentiment down to her bones, and "I feel that," she'd said. "My 6, they're my whole world. They're all I have left of my daughter and everything I do, every shift I work, every time I want to quit. I look at them and remember why I can't. Keisha would have wanted me to protect them, raise them right. So that's what I'm doing, even when it's killing me." Callum had nodded, his eyes meeting hers with that recognition again, that understanding that needed no translation. What Nadine didn't tell Callum was that Marcus had noticed, had started making comments about your white friend next door, with a sneer that made her stomach turn, had accused her of disrespecting him in his own house by being friendly with another man. She'd tried to explain that Callum was just a neighbor, just someone being kind, but Marcus's insecurity had grown teeth and claws. The fights got worse, his absences got longer, and Nadine found herself caught between the man she'd let into her life 2 years ago when grief had made her vulnerable, and the quiet presence of someone who treated her like a human being instead of a burden. She wasn't stupid. She knew how this looked from the outside, but inside her heart where the truth lived, she knew she wasn't falling for Callum. She was just remembering what it felt like to be seen, to be helped, to matter to someone. And that realization scared her more than any fight with Marcus ever had, because it meant she'd forgotten her own worth somewhere between bearing her daughter and becoming a young grandmother to 6 babies who needed her to be strong. Chapter 5. Breaking point. July brought storms that shook the duplex windows and an electricity bill Nadine couldn't pay. She'd been short on rent twice, and Mr. Patterson, the landlord, had started leaving voicemails that were polite on the surface, but threatening underneath. Marcus had been gone for 12 days straight this time, and she'd stopped pretending to the kids that he was coming back soon. Donte had stopped asking. The nursing home had cut her hours because budget issues, and Nadine had cried in her car in the parking lot trying to figure out how to make $70 stretch across groceries, gas, and keeping the power on. She'd called her sister, but her sister was helping her own grandkids whose father just got locked up, and Nadine had hung up feeling more alone than she had since that state trooper knocked on her door 3 years ago to tell her Keisha was gone. That's when Callum found her sitting on the porch steps at midnight, staring at a shut-off notice from the power company. She hadn't heard him approach, and when he'd said her name gently, she jumped, her heart racing. Sorry, he'd said, holding up his hands. "Didn't mean to scare you. I saw you out here and wanted to make sure you were okay." The laugh that came out of her had been bitter and sharp. "Do I look okay?" she'd snapped, then immediately felt bad because he was just trying to be nice and she was taking her anger out on him. But Callum hadn't flinched. He'd sat down on the step below her, giving her space, but staying close enough that she didn't feel alone. "No," he'd said honestly. "You look like you're carrying the world and the world is winning." The truth of it, had hit her so hard she'd started crying again, ugly tears that she couldn't stop. 43 years old, crying like a child because she couldn't keep the lights on for her grandbabies. Callum had let her cry without trying to fix it or tell her it would be okay. When she'd finally gotten herself together enough to explain the power company, the rent, Marcus being gone, the kids needing things she couldn't afford, he'd listened without judgment. Then he'd done something that shocked her. He'd pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. "How much do you need?" he'd asked. Nadine had shaken her head immediately. "I'm not taking your money. I wasn't telling you so you'd..." "I know," Callum had interrupted, "but I'm offering anyway. How much?" She'd wanted to refuse, but the shutoff notice in her hand and in the image of her 6 grandbabies in a house with no lights or AC in Georgia summer heat had overridden her pride. $300 would cover the power, she'd whispered, hating herself. "I'll pay you back every penny. I swear on my daughter's grave." He'd already been transferring the money before she'd finished speaking. "I don't want you to pay me back," Callum had said, locking his phone. "I want you to keep your lights on and feed those kids and not carry this alone anymore. Let me help. You shouldn't have to do this by yourself. You've already been through enough losing your daughter and taking on her children." Nadine had stared at this man who owed her nothing, who'd lived next door for 5 months and somehow seen her more clearly than her own man did, and something in her chest had cracked open. "Why do you care?" she'd asked, her voice small. "You don't even know me. These kids aren't your responsibility. I'm not your responsibility." Callum had been quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the empty street. "Because someone helped me when I was drowning," he'd said finally. "After my divorce, I had nothing. My brother-in-law covered my first month's rent here and never asked for it back. Told me to pay it forward someday. So that's what I'm doing, and because you deserve better than what you're getting. You lost your daughter and stepped up for her kids when a lot of people would have let the system take them. That's strength that deserves support." The money had cleared the next morning, and Nadine had paid the power bill before it got shut off. She'd also started keeping a notebook where she tracked every dollar she'd borrowed from Callum, even though he'd told her not to worry about it. That night, Marcus had come home drunk and mean, smelling like perfume that wasn't Nadine's and spoiling for a fight. He'd seen the paid power bill on the counter and something in his face had darkened. "Where'd you get money?" he'd demanded. When she'd explained that a neighbor had loaned it to her, he'd exploded, accused her of sleeping with Callum, called her names that made the kids cry, grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks that would last 5 days. Donte had tried to step between them, and Marcus had pushed the boy hard enough that he'd hit the wall. That's when Nadine had screamed at him to get out and never come back. And this time, she'd meant it. Young grandma, finding her voice again, protecting her babies the way she wished she could have protected her own child from that drunk driver 3 years ago. Chapter 6. Crossing lines. Marcus didn't come back after that night, but he sent his cousin to get his things, and that felt more final than a conversation would have. Nadine had packed his clothes in trash bags and left them on the porch because she didn't want him in her house, even for the 5 minutes it would take to collect them. The kids asked questions she didn't have good answers for. How do you explain to your grandbabies that another man walked away from them? First, their mothers, various baby daddies who'd never stuck around, then their actual mother taken by death, now this. She'd stopped wearing the promise ring Marcus had given her, and the white line it left on her finger felt like an accusation. Mrs. Chin had brought over egg rolls and hugged Nadine without saying anything, which somehow meant more than words would have. "You're still young," Mrs. Chin had said finally. 43 is not old. You have time to find happiness again." But Nadine didn't feel young. She felt ancient and tired and used up. Callum had been careful in the days after Marcus left. too careful, like he was afraid of making things worse or giving the neighborhood something to talk about. But Nadine had seen him watching when she was outside with the kids, his eyes scanning them like he was checking to make sure they were okay. One evening, when she'd been sitting on the porch trying to get Sienna to take a bottle, he'd come over with that hesitation that meant he didn't want to overstep. Can I ask you something? He'd said, his voice low. She'd nodded, adjusting Sienna's weight in her arms. The bruise is on your arm, he'd started, and Nadine had immediately pulled her sleeve down, even though it was 90 degrees. Did he? He's gone. She cut him off, her voice hard, and he's not coming back, so it doesn't matter. But the look on Callum's face had told her it did matter, at least to him. At least someone cared that she'd been hurt. If he comes back and gives you trouble, call me, Callum had said, and there was steel in his voice that surprised her. I'm serious, Nadine. Anytime, day or night, I'm right next door. She'd wanted to say she could handle it, that she'd been handling men's moods and anger since she was 16 years old, but the truth was she was tired. Tired of being strong. Tired of fighting. Tired of doing everything alone. Okay, she'd whispered, and Sienna had chosen that moment to finally take the bottle, her little hands grabbing at it like she'd been starving. Callum had smiled at that, one of his rare full smiles that changed his whole face, and something in Nadine's stomach had flipped in a way that had nothing to do with fear or stress. She'd pushed the feeling down because there was no room in her life for attraction or complications or anything that looked like hope when it came to men. She'd buried her only child and inherited 6 grandchildren. That was enough drama for one lifetime. But over the next 2 weeks, something shifted. Maybe it was the absence of Marcus's weight pressing down on the house. Maybe it was the way the kids started laughing more freely without worrying about setting him off. Maybe it was Riley coming over to play with Amaya and the twins on Callum's weekends, and Nadine watching how gentle he was with his daughter, how patient. She'd catch herself looking for him when she got home from work, would find excuses to be outside when she knew he'd be coming home from a job site. They'd started having real conversations, not just surface pleasantries, but actual talk about life and dreams and regrets. She learned he wanted to open his own restoration business someday. He'd learned she'd wanted to be a nurse before she'd gotten pregnant at 16 with Keisha, and all her plans had changed. He'd learned about the grief that still sat heavy in her chest 3 years after burying her daughter, how some nights she'd wake up reaching for the phone to call Keisha before remembering she was gone. One Saturday night when the kids were all asleep and Nadine had been sitting on her porch drinking the cheap wine her coworker had given her, Callum had joined her without being invited. They'd sat in comfortable silence for a while before he'd spoken. Can I tell you something? He'd asked. I moved here after my divorce because I needed to disappear for a while, start over somewhere nobody knew me or what I'd been through. And for 6 months, I lived like a ghost. Work, home, sleep, repeat. Then you and your grandkids moved in next door and life got loud. He'd smiled when he'd said it. At first I was annoyed. All the noise, the crying, the chaos. But then I realized I'd been dead inside, and your family was this proof that life still happened, that it was messy and hard, but real. And he'd looked at her then, really looked at her. You're the strongest person I've ever met, and you don't even see it. You buried your daughter and took on her children without hesitation. That's not something everyone could do. The words had landed in Nadine's chest like stones, heavy and permanent, and she'd realized that for the first time since Keisha died, someone saw her as more than just a grieving mother turned overwhelmed grandmother. Someone saw her as a woman, as a person, as someone who mattered beyond the roles she filled. And that recognition had felt like coming up for air after drowning for 3 years straight. Chapter 7. The shift. August arrived with heat that made the asphalt shimmer and a shift in how Nadine's life felt in her own skin. The kids had settled into their new normal, a Marcus who'd disappeared completely, a grandmother who worked herself half to death but smiled more now than she had in years, and a neighbor who'd become something more than that without anyone officially naming it. Riley started spending full weekends at Callum's, and Amaya treated her like the big sister she'd always wanted. Donte had started helping Callum with small projects around his duplex, learning how to fix drywall and replace door hinges, and Nadine watched her oldest grandson's shoulders straighten with pride when Callum praised his work. The twins followed Callum around like ducklings when he was outside. Even baby Sienna would reach for him now when he came over, calling him Cal in her baby voice that made everyone smile. And that terrified Nadine more than anything, because what if this didn't last? What if Callum woke up one day and realized that taking on a 43-year-old grandmother with 6 kids was too much weight for any man to carry? What if he left like Marcus had, like all of Keisha's baby daddies had, like every man in her life eventually did? She'd been sitting with these fears on a Wednesday night when Callum had knocked on her door, holding a pizza and looking nervous. "I need to talk to you," he'd said, and her stomach had dropped because that's what people said before they told you bad news. She'd let him in, her hands shaking slightly as she cleared space on the couch that the kids had buried under blankets and stuffed animals. "What's wrong?" she'd asked, preparing herself for the goodbye she'd been expecting since this whole thing started, preparing herself to be alone again, to add another loss to the collection she'd been building since she was too young to know better. But Callum hadn't given her bad news. Instead, he'd set the pizza down and taken a breath like he was about to jump off something high. "I need you to know that what I'm about to say isn't because I expect anything or want anything from you except honesty," he'd start. "And if this makes things weird, I'll back off and we can go back to just being neighbors. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel." Nadine's heart had been pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "So, I care about you," Callum had continued, his eyes locked on hers. "Not in a friendly neighbor way, in a way that makes me think about you when I'm supposed to be working, in a way that makes me want to fix everything that's broken in your life, even though I know I can't, in a way that makes me look at those 6 kids and see a family I want to be part of, not a burden I'm tolerating. I know you've been through hell. I know you're still grieving your daughter. I know you're exhausted and probably think you're too old or too complicated for this kind of thing. But I'm telling you anyway, because I can't not tell you anymore." The silence after his confession had been thick enough to cut. Nadine had stared at this man who just laid his heart on her coffee table and hadn't known whether to laugh or cry or run. "I'm 43 years old," she'd said finally, her voice rough. "I'm a grandmother raising 6 kids that should have been my daughter's responsibility, except she's dead and buried 3 years now. I'm broke. I'm tired. I've got a body that shows every year I've lived and every baby I've helped raise. My ex-boyfriend might show up and start trouble. My life is chaos and noise and grief that doesn't go away just because time passes. There's no room for romance or dating or whatever this is supposed to be." She'd stood up, pacing now because sitting felt impossible. "You're a good man, Callum, the best man I've met in a long time, but you deserve someone without all this mess. Someone younger who can give you attention and time." "And I don't want someone younger," Callum had interrupted, standing too. "I don't want someone else. I want you, exactly as you are. With all 6 kids and all the grief and all the chaos, I want this life because it's real and you're real, and I've been half dead since my divorce until you reminded me what living actually looks like." The kiss had happened before, either of them had planned it. 1 second, Nadine had been listing all the reasons this was impossible, and the next Callum's hands were in her hair and his mouth was on hers, and the world had narrowed to that single point of contact. She'd kissed him back without thinking, years of being touched only in anger or obligation melting away under the gentle pressure of his lips. When they'd broken apart, both breathing hard, she'd seen tears in his eyes that matched the ones in her own. "I'm scared," she'd whispered against his mouth. "I buried my daughter, and I'm raising her. Babies, and I can't lose anything else. I can't handle another person leaving." "Me too," he'd whispered back, "but I'm more scared of missing this, of missing you, of being a coward who let the best thing walk away because I was afraid." From upstairs, Caleb had called out that he needed water, and the real world had crashed back in. But as Callum had stepped back to give her space to go be a grandmother, he'd caught her hand and squeezed it once. "Think about it," he'd said. "No pressure, just think about it. Think about letting yourself have something good for once." And Nadine had gone upstairs to get her grandson water while her heart beat a rhythm it hadn't beaten in years. The rhythm of hope, of possibility, of maybe not being alone anymore. Chapter 8. Falling forward. Thinking about it was all Nadine did for the next 3 days. She'd analyzed it from every angle. The practical concerns, the emotional risks, what it would mean for the kids, what it would mean for her. She called her sister, who'd said, "Girl, when's the last time a man made you smile just by existing? When's the last time someone helped you without making it a debt? You 43, not 83? You allowed to have happiness even while you're grieving Keisha?" She'd watched how Callum interacted with her grandchildren, looking for red flags or signs that this was too good to be true, but all she'd found was genuine affection and patience. He'd helped Donte with homework without making the boy feel stupid. He'd sat through 20 minutes of Ezra explaining his favorite Pokemon with real interest. He'd rocked Sienna to sleep when Nadine had been dead on her feet after a double shift. He'd treated her grandbabies like they mattered, not because he was trying to get with their grandmother, but because they were human beings worthy of kindness. The decision had come on a Saturday morning when Nadine had been standing in her kitchen making breakfast for 7 and realized she wasn't exhausted for the first time in months. Callum and Riley had come over the night before for a movie night that had turned into Riley and Amaya building a blanket fort while the boys argued about what movie to watch, and Callum had somehow mediated without anyone crying. He'd stayed to help clean up after, wash and dish while Nadine had put the younger kids to bed. And when they'd finally been alone in the kitchen at midnight, he looked at her and said, "This is my favorite place to be. Not a bar with friends, not somewhere exciting. Her chaotic kitchen with sticky counters and mismatched dishes and the lingering smell of whatever Caleb had spilled earlier." That's when she'd known, that's when she'd realized that maybe God hadn't just taken Keisha away. Maybe he'd also sent someone to help carry what was left behind. "I want to try," she told him the next day when he'd been on his porch and she'd walked over before she could lose her nerve. "Try what?" he'd asked, looking up from the book he'd been reading. "This, us, whatever it is. I want to try. I'm still scared and I still don't know if I'm making a mistake, but I want to try anyway." The smile that had broken across his face had been like sunrise. Yeah, but we go slow. The kids come first, always. And if this gets complicated or messy, it'll get complicated and messy. Callum had cut her off gently. "Life is complicated and messy, but I'm in it anyway. However slow you need to go, however careful we need to be, I'm here." So they'd started dating, if you could call it that, when you were both parents with no babysitters and no money for fancy restaurants. Their dates were sitting on her porch after the kids were asleep. Stolen kisses in his kitchen when Riley was with her mom and Nadine's grandkids were occupied with cartoons. Text messages during work hours that made her smile at her phone like a teenager, even though she was 43 and a grandmother. but not everyone had been happy about the relationship. Marcus had found out, probably from one of his boys who still lived in the neighborhood, and had shown up drunk and angry one night, banging on Nadine's door and yelling about how she was disrespecting him by letting some white boy around his kids. Except they weren't his kids, they were Keisha's kids. They were Nadine's grandbabies, and Marcus had given up any claim to them when he'd walked out. Callum had come outside immediately, still barefoot, but with that steel in his voice that Nadine had heard before. "You need to leave," he'd told Marcus. "Now, or I'm calling the police." The fight that had almost happened would have destroyed everything if Mrs. Chin hadn't already called 911. And if Donte hadn't come outside and told Marcus in a voice too old for 12 that he needed to go away and stay away, that his grandmother deserved better, that his mother would have wanted better for all of them. Marcus had left that night, but his anger had hung in the air like smoke, and Nadine had known it wasn't over, so still she'd let herself have this happiness. Let herself fall into Callum's steady presence and the way he made her feel like a woman instead of just a grieving mother and overwhelmed grandmother. Let herself imagine a future where she wasn't doing everything alone, where someone stood beside her sharing the weight. He'd started staying for dinner most nights, helping with homework and bath time and the 1,000 small tasks that came with 6 kids. Riley had started calling Nadine by her name instead of Amaya's grandma, which somehow felt significant. The twins had asked if Callum was going to be their grandpa now, and Nadine had explained gently that it didn't work that way, that adults needed time just like kids did, but inside her heart had done something complicated and hopeful. For the first time since she buried her daughter 3 years ago, Nadine had looked at her life and seen possibility instead of just survival. And that feeling, fragile as it was, had been worth protecting at any cost. Young grandma finding love again, learning that 43 wasn't too old to start over, that grief and joy could exist in the same heart at the same time. Chapter 9, The Storm. Everything came crashing down on a September evening when the sky was threatening rain, and Nadine had been making spaghetti for the 3rd time that week because it was cheap and fed everyone. Marcus had shown up with his cousin and 2 other men Nadine didn't recognize, all of them drunk and loud and looking for trouble. He'd pounded on the door hard enough to shake it in the frame, and Donte had immediately grabbed Sienna and taken her and the younger kids upstairs like they'd practiced for situations exactly like this. Only Donte had stayed at the top of the stairs, his phone in his hand with 911 already dialed and his finger hovering over the call button. This 12-year-old boy trying to protect his grandmother and siblings the way nobody had protected his mother from that drunk driver. Nadine's heart had been in her throat as she'd opened the door with the chain still on, trying to seem calm even though she was terrified. She wasn't young anymore, and these were grown men with violence in their eyes. "We need to talk," Marcus had slurred, his eyes red and unfocused. "No, we don't," Nadine had said firmly, her voice stronger than she felt. "You need to leave. Now. You walked out on us and you don't get to come back making demands." But he'd shouldered against the door, and the chain had broken easier than it should have, and suddenly he was inside her house with 3 men behind him, and the situation had gone from scary to dangerous in seconds. "You think you can replace me?" Marcus had yelled, getting in her face. "You think some white boy can come in and play grandfather to kids that ain't even yours by blood? They your daughter's mistakes and you stuck with them, and now you bringing strangers around them?" His breath had been pure alcohol and rage. "They're not mistakes," Nadine had shot back, anger overriding her fear. "They're my grandbabies. They're all I have left of Keisha, and Callum is more of a man than you'll ever be. He shows up, he helps. He doesn't disappear or put his hands on me or make them afraid in their own house." The slap had come so fast, she hadn't had time to dodge it. Nadine's face had exploded with pain, and she'd stumbled back against the wall, tasting blood where her tooth had cut her lip. She'd heard Donte scream from upstairs and the sound of running feet, and then Callum had been there, bursting through the still open door like something unleashed. What happened next had been chaos. Callum grabbing Marcus and throwing him against the opposite wall, his cousin trying to jump in and getting an elbow to the face, the other men realizing this wasn't the easy fight they'd expected. Nadine had been screaming for everyone to stop, terrified that Callum was going to get hurt, or worse, terrified that her grandbabies were watching their whole world explode just 3 years after watching their mother's funeral. The sirens had started in the distance, getting closer, and that's what had finally broken it up. Marcus and his boys had run like roaches when lights come on, leaving Callum standing in her destroyed living room with blood on his knuckles and murder in his eyes. But when he turned to Nadine, all that anger had melted into concern. "Are you okay?" he'd asked, turning to her immediately, his hands gentle on her face as he'd examined where Marcus had hit her. "Did he hurt you anywhere else? The kids are upstairs," Nadine had managed, her voice shaking. "I'm okay, But she wasn't okay. Her hands were trembling and her face hurt, and her house had just been violated, and her grandchildren had seen their grandmother get hit, and she felt like everything she'd been trying to build was crumbling around her. The police had arrived and taken statements documenting the broken chain and Nadine's swelling face and Callum's scraped knuckles. Mrs. Chin had come over and taken Riley to her house so she wouldn't have to be part of this. A young officer with kind eyes had told Nadine she needed to file for a restraining order and had given her resources for domestic violence support. Another officer had asked about Marcus's full name and last known address and whether he'd done this before. 43 years old, filling out police reports while her grandbabies hid upstairs. This wasn't how her life was supposed to go. After everyone had left and statements were taken, and Callum had finally convinced her to let him stay until she felt safe, Nadine had gone upstairs to find her 6 grandbabies huddled together in Donte in the twins' room like a pack of scared animals. Donte had been holding Sienna while Amaya clung to his side, all of them crying or trying not to. "I'm sorry," Nadine had whispered, gathering as many of them as she could reach into her arms. "I'm so sorry you had to see that. I'm so sorry. Your mama would be so mad at me for letting this happen." "Mama's not here," Donte had said, his voice breaking. "But you are, and you protected us." "Is he coming back?" Caleb had asked, his voice tiny with fear. "No," Callum had said from the doorway, and every eye had turned to him. "He's not coming back. I promise you that. And if he tries, I'll be here. Your grandma will be here. We're all going to keep you safe." Ezra had been the first to move, running to Callum and wrapping his arms around his waist, and like dominoes, the rest had followed until Callum was surrounded by her grandchildren, all of them seeking the safety he represented. Nadine had watched through tears and known with absolute certainty that this man was what she needed all along, not someone to save her, but someone to stand with her while she protected what was left of her daughter's legacy. Chapter 10, New Ground. The restraining order went through in a week, and Marcus was officially barred from coming within 500 feet of Nadine or the kids. He'd violated it once, drunk texts at 2 a.m, and had spent a night in jail that apparently scared him enough to stop trying. His mother had called crying and apologizing, saying she'd send money for the grandbabies, which she did, $100 a month. That helped more than Nadine wanted to admit. Slowly, the fear that had been living in her chest started to ease. The kids began sleeping through the night again. Donte's grades came up. The twins stopped jumping at loud noises. Amaya went back to her silly 7-year-old self who made up songs about everything. And Callum stayed not as a hero or savior, but as a partner, steady and present and real in ways Nadine was still learning to trust. A 43-year-old grandmother learning that it wasn't too late for love, that grief and joy could share the same space, that she deserved support even while she was giving everything she had to 6 children who'd lost their mother too young. 3 months after that terrible September night, Callum had asked Nadine to officially be his girlfriend like they were teenagers, and she'd laughed until she'd cried because the absurdity of putting teenage labels on their complicated adult situation was somehow perfect. They told the kids together on a Sunday afternoon, sitting them all down in the living room that Callum had helped repaint after the break-in. "So, you're together now?" Donte had asked, looking between them with an expression that was hard to read. "Yeah," Nadine had confirmed, reaching for Callum's hand. "How do y'all feel about that?" There'd been a long pause where the kids had looked at each other like they were having a silent conversation. And then Ezra had said, "Does this mean Callum can come to my birthday party?" And everyone had laughed, and the tension had broken like morning fog. "He better come," Amaya had added. "He promised to help with the decorations." Just like that, it was decided. Just like that, they were becoming something like a family. Riley had started calling Nadine's place the other house and splitting her time between both when she was with Callum. She'd become a fixture at family dinners, helping with the younger kids and teaching Amaya to read above her grade level. Nadine's sister had finally met Callum in October and had pulled her aside to say, "That man looks at you like you're the most important person in the world. Don't let fear make you push away something good. Keisha will want you to be happy, you know that." It had been the permission Nadine had known she'd needed, hearing that her daughter would have approved. By November, they'd established a routine. Callum would come over after work, help with dinner and homework, stay until the kids were in bed, then go back to his place. On his Riley weekends, they'd combine the families, and the chaos was loud and messy and exactly what Nadine had never known she'd wanted. They weren't perfect. They still fought about stupid things like whose turn it was to take out the trash or how to discipline Caleb when he wouldn't listen. But they fought fair, and they said sorry, and they showed up for each other day after exhausting day. In December, when Atlanta got the rare snowstorm that turned everything white and magical, Callum had shown up at Nadine's door with sleds for all the kids and hot chocolate mix and a smile that made her stomach flip the way it used to when she was young and the world felt full of possibility. They'd spent the afternoon at the park watching 7 kids play in snow that probably wouldn't last 24 hours. And Nadine had stood next to this man who'd appear in her life exactly when she needed him most and felt something settle in her chest. The grief for Keisha was still there. It would always be there. But it had made room for this new thing, this love that had grown quiet and steady like a plant you didn't know was taking root until suddenly it was blooming. "I love you," she'd said, not planning it, just letting it out into the cold December air. Callum had turned to her with snow in his hair, and that smile she'd come to know better than her own, and said, "I love you too. You and all 6 of them in this beautiful, messy, loud life you've built out of grief and determination." They kissed while the kids threw snowballs, and Riley took pictures on her phone, and Mrs. Chen watched from her window and probably told the whole neighborhood by dinner. That evening, after everyone was warm and dry and fed, and the kids were finally asleep after the excitement of snow, Nadine had sat on her couch in the quiet with Callum beside her and taken inventory of her life. And she was 43 now, still young enough to start over, old enough to know what mattered. She had 6 grandchildren who were healthy and loved and learning that family could be built from broken pieces. She had a job that paid the bills even if it didn't pay enough. She had a house that stayed warm and lights that stayed on. She She had a man who chose her every single day and treated her grandchildren like they were precious. She had survived bearing her daughter and had come out stronger on the other side. "Thank you," she'd whispered to Callum. "For what?" he'd asked, genuinely confused. "For seeing me," Nadine had said, her voice thick with emotion. "For showing up, for loving these babies like they're yours, for teaching me that 43 ain't too old to fall in love again, for helping me believe that Keisha's legacy lives on, not just in these kids, but in the family we're all building together." Callum had pulled her close then, her head on his chest where she could hear his heartbeats, steady as a drum. "You taught me the same thing," he'd whispered into her hair. "You taught me what real strength looks like, what real love looks like." And in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of all she'd survived and built and protected, Nadine knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. A young grandma raising 6 kids who were hers by blood and love, loved by a man who chose them all. And finally learning what it meant to not carry everything alone. Learning that grief could share space with joy, that endings could become beginnings, and that sometimes the neighbor next door turned out to be exactly what you never knew you needed.